David Miller stood on his back porch watching the morning mist rise from the creek that ran through his property. The coffee in his hands was still steaming, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the gentle sound of water flowing over rocks. This was his favorite time of day. Peaceful, quiet, just him and the 200 acres of land his grandfather had left him 15 years ago. The property was something special. Rolling hills covered in oak and maple trees, winding trails that deer had worn down over decades, and a creek that never ran dry, even in the hottest summers. When his grandfather passed away, David had been working in the city as an accountant. The inheritance changed everything. He quit his job, moved to the countryside, and never looked back. David had always been a hunter. His grandfather taught him when he was just 12 years old. They would wake up before dawn, pack their gear, and spend hours sitting quietly in the woods. His grandfather taught him about patience, respect for nature, and following the rules. "The woods don't belong to us," the old man used to say. "We're just borrowing them for a while." Those lessons stuck with David. He hunted during the legal seasons, followed all the state regulations, and always made sure he was hunting in safe areas. The property was perfect for it, large enough that he could hunt in sections far away from any roads or houses. When he first moved there, the nearest neighbor was almost a mile away. But things changed over the years. About 8 years ago, a development company bought the land next to his property. They built a subdivision called Sunrise Ridge. Big houses with perfect lawns and 3-car garages. The kind of place where every mailbox looked exactly the same. And the homeowners association had rules about what color you could paint your front door. At first, David wasn't sure how he felt about having so many new neighbors. The construction was loud and messy, trucks rumbling past his driveway every day for 2 years. But once the houses were finished and families started moving in, things settled down. The new residents discovered something wonderful about their neighborhood. David's property had old logging trails that connected to the edge of their subdivision. The trails were beautiful. They wound through thick forests, crossed the creek in 3 different places, and led to a small clearing at the top of a hill where you could see for miles. It started with just a few people. A couple from the subdivision asked David if they could walk their dog on his trails. He said yes. Then a family with young kids asked if they could go hiking. David didn't mind. The trails were old and well established. A few people walking on them wouldn't hurt anything. Word spread quickly through Sunrise Ridge. Soon David would see joggers on his trails in the early morning, families having picnics by the creek on weekends, kids riding their bikes on the wider paths. Even the local high school cross-country team started using his property for practice runs. David never asked for anything in return. He didn't charge money or ask people to sign papers. It was just neighbors being neighborly. His grandfather had taught him about community. "Help people when you can," the old man always said. What goes around comes around. The arrangement worked well for years. David kept hunting in the sections of his property that were far from the trails. The residents of Sunrise Ridge got to enjoy nature walks and outdoor activities. Everyone was happy. David took pride in maintaining the trails. He would clear fallen branches after storms. He built a small wooden bridge over the creek where the water ran deepest. He even put up a few benches in scenic spots where people could sit and rest. Some of the residents started bringing him homemade cookies or fresh vegetables from their gardens as a way to say thank you. The property became an important part of life for many. Families in Sunrise Ridge, real estate agents, would show the trails to potential buyers as one of the neighborhood's best features. "Look at this beautiful open space right next to your backyard," they would say. "It's like having your own private nature preserve." Parents felt safe letting their children explore the woods. The trails were well marked and easy to follow. David had even installed a few emergency call boxes along the routes, just in case someone got hurt or lost. He wanted everyone to feel welcome and secure on his land. During hunting season, David was always careful to post signs letting people know when he would be hunting and which areas to avoid. He hunted early in the morning or late in the afternoon when the trails were usually empty. He never had any problems or close calls. Safety was always his top priority. The local wildlife seemed to thrive with the arrangement too. Having people on the trails regularly actually helped keep the deer and other animals alert and healthy. The creek stayed clean because David and many of the trail users picked up any litter they found. It was a perfect example of how people and nature could coexist. Some of David's best memories from those years happened on his own property. He remembered the morning he was sitting in his deer stand and watched a young father teach his son how to identify different bird calls. He remembered the day a group of elderly residents organized a nature photography walk and spent hours capturing pictures of wildflowers and butterflies. During the spring migration, birdwatchers would set up their equipment along the creek before sunrise. David would sometimes join them, sharing his coffee and listening to their excitement when they spotted a rare species. These weren't just people using his land anymore. They had become part of his extended community. The high school cross-country team was especially grateful for the trails. Their coach, an energetic woman named Coach Rodriguez, would bring the kids to practice 3 times a week during the season. She always made sure the young athletes were respectful of the property and picked up after themselves. David enjoyed watching them improve their times and build their confidence on his trails. Everything seemed perfect. David had his hunting, the neighbors had their outdoor recreation, and everyone respected each other's needs. He never imagined that this peaceful arrangement would one day lead to the biggest conflict of his life. Looking back, David realizes that he probably should have put the arrangement in writing from the beginning. But at the time it seemed unnecessary. These were good people, neighbors, friends even. Trust and handshake agreements had always been enough in his family. His grandfather would have been proud to see how the land was being used and enjoyed by so many people. The old man had always believed that land was meant to be shared, within reason. David was carrying on that tradition in his own way, but change was coming to Sunrise Ridge, and with it, trouble that David never saw coming. The trouble started on a crisp October morning during deer season. David had been up since 4 in the morning, like he did every hunting day. He checked his equipment, packed his gear, and headed to his tree stand in the far corner of his property. This spot was more than half a mile from the nearest trail that residents used for hiking. He had chosen it specifically to avoid any conflicts. The morning hunt was peaceful. David saw a few deer, but none that met the criteria he had set for himself. He was a selective hunter, only taking mature animals and never more than he needed. By 9 o'clock, he was ready to head back to the house for breakfast. But as he walked back along one of his private access roads, he saw something that surprised him. A woman he didn't recognize was standing near the edge of his property, talking on her phone. She was clearly upset about something, gesturing wildly with her free hand. David approached carefully. "Good morning," he called out when he was still a good distance away. "Can I help you with something?" The woman turned around and David could see that she was angry. She was probably in her 50s, wearing expensive hiking clothes and carrying a small designer backpack. Everything about her screamed city person who had moved to the suburbs. "Are you the owner of this property?" she demanded, pointing at David's rifle, which he was carrying safely according to all proper protocols. "Yes, ma'am. I'm David Miller. This is my land. Is there a problem?" "A problem," she almost shouted. "You're shooting guns right next to where families are trying to enjoy nature. My grandchildren could have been killed." David was confused. He hadn't seen anyone on the trails that morning, and his hunting spot was far from any of the public access areas. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. Where exactly were your grandchildren?" The woman pointed toward a section of the property that David knew was nowhere near where he had been hunting. "We were on the yellow trail trying to have a peaceful morning walk when we heard gunshots. Loud ones. It scared my 4-year-old grandson so badly that he started crying." David realized what had happened. The yellow trail was one of the more popular hiking routes, but it was also one of the farthest from his hunting areas. Sound could carry strangely in the woods, especially on a quiet morning. What she had heard was probably his single shot from more than half a mile away. "Ma'am, I understand that hearing gunshots can be startling," David said, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful. "But I was hunting in a completely different section of the property, more than half a mile from any of the trails. I've been hunting here for 15 years without any incidents." "I don't care how long you've been doing it," the woman snapped. "It's dangerous and inappropriate. There are children using these trails, families, senior citizens. You could kill someone?" David tried to explain the safety measures he took. The distance between his hunting areas and the trails, the signs he posted during hunting season, the fact that he hunted during times when trail usage was typically low. But the woman wasn't interested in hearing any of it. "This is exactly the kind of thing our homeowners association needs to address," she said, pulling out her phone. I'm documenting this conversation and filing a formal complaint." Before David could say anything else, she was walking away, talking rapidly into her phone about dangerous hunters and unsafe conditions and property values. David stood there for a moment, holding his rifle and trying to process what had just happened. In 15 years of hunting on his own property, he had never had a single complaint or safety issue. Now suddenly he was being treated like some kind of reckless criminal. A few days later, David received his first official letter from the Sunrise Ridge Homeowners Association. It was delivered by certified mail, which seemed unnecessarily formal for a neighborhood disagreement. The letter was signed by someone named Patricia Kellerman, who identified herself as the newly elected president of the HOA board. The letter was not friendly. It accused David of creating a public nuisance and endangering the safety of residents. It claimed that his hunting activities violated several city ordinances related to noise pollution and discharge of firearms. Most shocking of all, it demanded that he immediately cease all hunting activities on his property. David read the letter 3 times, getting angrier each time. The woman who had confronted him had clearly escalated the situation far beyond what was reasonable. He had been hunting on his own land, following all state and local laws for more than a decade before most of these people had even moved to the area. He decided to do some research. David drove to the city hall and asked to see the ordinances mentioned in the letter. What he found was interesting. There was indeed a noise ordinance on the books, but it specifically exempted legal hunting activities on private property. The firearms discharge ordinance only applied to areas within city limits, and his property was in the county. Armed with this information, David wrote a polite but firm response to the HOA. He explained that his hunting was completely legal, that he took extensive safety precautions, and that he had been a good neighbor for years by allowing residents to use his trails. He suggested a meeting to discuss any concerns and find a reasonable solution. The response he got back was not what he expected. Instead of agreeing to meet, the HOA board sent an even more aggressive letter. This one was written by a lawyer and threatened legal action if David continued hunting. It also mentioned that they were exploring all available options to address the situation. David learned that Patricia Kellerman, the new HOA president, was a retired city planner who had moved to Sunrise Ridge just 6 months earlier. She had run for the board on a platform of improving neighborhood safety and property values. Apparently, she saw his hunting as a threat to both. The conflict escalated quickly from there. Patricia organized a petition drive, asking residents to sign a document supporting the ban on hunting near their neighborhood. She sent flyers to every house in Sunrise Ridge, describing David's hunting in dramatic terms that made it sound like he was firing artillery in people's backyards. Many residents signed the petition without really understanding the situation. They had never seen David hunt, didn't know about his safety precautions, and were understandably concerned when told that dangerous hunting activities were happening near their children. But some residents pushed back. Coach Rodriguez from the high school wrote a letter to the HOA board supporting David. She pointed out that he had always been respectful and safe, and that the cross-country team had never had any issues during their practices. Several longtime residents also spoke up, saying that they had never felt unsafe on the trails during hunting season. The debate divided the neighborhood. Some residents supported Patricia's aggressive approach, believing that any hunting near a residential area was inappropriate. Others felt that David was being treated unfairly, and that the HOA was overstepping its authority. David found himself in an impossible position. He was being painted as a villain for engaging in illegal activity on his own property. The stress was affecting his sleep, his health, and his relationships with neighbors he had considered friends. The situation got worse when Patricia convinced the city council to review the ordinances related to hunting and firearms. She argued that the current laws were outdated and didn't account for increased residential development. She pushed for new restrictions that would effectively ban hunting on any property within 2 miles of a residential subdivision. David realized that this wasn't just about his property anymore. If Patricia succeeded in changing the laws, it would affect hunters throughout the county. Rural property owners would lose rights they had exercised for generations, all because some suburban residents were uncomfortable with traditional country activities. He decided to fight back, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Patricia had already proven that she was organized, determined and willing to use the legal system to get what she wanted. David was just one man with a hunting rifle and a love for the land his grandfather had left him. The battle lines were drawn, and David was about to learn just how expensive it could be to defend your rights against a determined homeowners association. David thought the worst was behind him when he sent his response to the HOA, explaining that his hunting was completely legal. He was wrong. Patricia Kellerman and her board were just getting started. 2 weeks after David's letter, Patricia showed up at a city council meeting with a folder full of documents and a group of concerned residents. She had done her homework. Patricia presented a detailed presentation about noise, pollution, and public safety risks associated with hunting near residential areas. She had recordings of gunshots taken from various locations in Sunrise Ridge. She had photographs of children playing near the trails. She even had a petition with over 200 signatures from residents demanding action. The presentation was professional, convincing, and completely one-sided. David didn't know about the meeting until after it was over. A neighbor called to tell him that the city council had voted to investigate his hunting activities and consider new restrictions. That's when David realized he was dealing with more than just an angry homeowner. Patricia was running a coordinated campaign against him. The investigation started with a city inspector showing up at David's property unannounced. The inspector, a nervous young man named Kevin, seemed uncomfortable with his assignment. He admitted to David that he didn't know much about hunting regulations and was just following orders from his supervisor. "Look, Mr. Miller," Kevin said as they walked David's property, "I can see that you're following all the state hunting laws. Your equipment is legal, you have proper licenses, and you're hunting in appropriate areas. But the city is under pressure to do something about the complaints." David showed Kevin his hunting locations, his safety measures, and the distance between his hunting areas and the public trails. Kevin took notes and measurements, clearly trying to be thorough and fair. At the end of the inspection, he told David that he would recommend no action be taken. But Kevin's recommendation never made it to the final report. David later learned that Patricia had met privately with the city's legal department and the mayor's office. She argued that the city could face liability issues if someone was injured by a stray bullet, even though David's hunting areas were positioned to make such an incident impossible. 3 weeks after the inspection, David received a citation in the mail. The city was fining him $500 for disturbing the peace during legal hunting hours. The citation claimed that his hunting activities created excessive noise that interfered with other residents' quiet enjoyment of the area. David was furious. He had been hunting the same land for 15 years. He followed every law and regulation. He had never had a safety incident or even a complaint until Patricia moved to the neighborhood. Now he was being treated like a criminal. The citation gave him 2 options: pay the fine and agree to stop hunting, or contest the citation in court. David didn't hesitate. He was going to fight this no matter what it cost. Finding a lawyer turned out to be harder than David expected. The first 3 attorneys he called said they didn't handle this type of case. The 4th lawyer, Robert Chen, agreed to take the case but warned David that it would be expensive and difficult. "The problem isn't the law," Robert explained during their first meeting. "You're absolutely right that you have the legal right to hunt on your property. The problem is politics. The city is feeling pressure from a vocal group of residents, and they're trying to find a way to appease them without getting sued." Robert's strategy was straightforward: prove that David's hunting was legal under both state and local law, demonstrate that he followed proper safety protocols, and show that the city's action was arbitrary and unfair. It sounded simple, but it required a lot of work and documentation. David had to hire an expert witness, an acoustics engineer who could testify about sound levels and distances. He had to gather years of hunting records proving his responsible behavior over time. He had to get character references from other hunters, conservation officers, and longtime residents who supported him. Meanwhile, Patricia wasn't sitting idle. She organized more petition drives, held neighborhood meetings, and even started a social media campaign against David. She created a Facebook page called Keep Sunrise Ridge Safe that portrayed David as a reckless hunter who was endangering children and families. The social media campaign was particularly vicious. Patricia and her supporters shared photos of David's hunting equipment, taken without his permission from the public trails. They posted dramatic stories about near misses and Traumatized children that David knew were exaggerated or completely false. The worst part was watching some of his former friends and neighbors turn against him. People who had used his trails for years and had always been friendly were now avoiding him at the grocery store or looking the other way when they saw him in town. Coach Rodriguez continued to support David, even though she faced pressure from some parents to stop using his property for cross-country practice. "Mr. Miller has always been a gentleman and a responsible neighbor," she said at one contentious school board meeting. These attacks on his character are unfair and based on fear, not facts. The legal process dragged on for months. Every court appearance meant taking time off work and paying legal fees. David had to hire a surveyor to create detailed maps of his property, showing exactly where he hunted and where the trails were located. He had to pay for noise level testing to prove that his hunting wasn't louder than other common activities like lawn mowing or construction work. The most frustrating part was that Patricia seemed to have unlimited time and resources to continue her campaign. She attended every court hearing, often bringing supporters to pack the courtroom. She wrote letters to the local newspaper, painting David as a stubborn landowner who cared more about his hobby than children's safety. David's legal bills mounted quickly. Attorney fees, expert witnesses, court costs, and lost income from taking time off work. By the time the case went to trial, he had spent over $12,000 defending his right to hunt on his own property. The trial lasted 3 days. Patricia testified about the fear and anxiety that gunshots caused in the neighborhood. She brought in residents who claimed their property values were declining because of the hunting. She even had a child psychologist testify about the potential trauma that loud noises could cause to young children. David's attorney presented a strong defense. The acoustics expert proved that gunshots from David's hunting areas were no louder at the nearest houses than normal traffic noise. Conservation officers testified about David's excellent safety record and responsible hunting practices. Property records showed that David had been hunting the land since before any of the residential development existed. The judge, an older man named Judge Williams who had grown up in a rural area, seemed skeptical of the city's case from the beginning. During closing arguments, he asked the city attorney some pointed questions about how they could find someone for illegal activity on private property. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, Judge Williams ruled in David's favor. He found that the city's noise ordinance could not be applied to legal hunting activities on private property. He ordered the city to refund David's $500 fine and dismissed all charges. But the victory felt hollow. David had won the legal battle, but he had spent nearly $15,000 in legal fees and costs. The stress had affected his health and his relationships. The neighborhood that had once felt like a friendly community now felt hostile and unwelcoming. Judge Williams made some comments after his ruling that stuck with David. "Property rights are fundamental to our legal system," the judge said. "When cities start restricting legal activities on private property because of political pressure, it sets a dangerous precedent. Mr. Miller should not have had to spend thousands of dollars to defend rights he clearly possessed." Patricia and the HOA board were not happy with the ruling. Within days of the decision, Patricia was back on social media and in the local newspaper, claiming that the judge didn't understand the real safety issues and promising to find other ways to address the problem. David realized that winning the court case hadn't ended his troubles. If anything, it had made Patricia and her supporters more determined to find ways to stop his hunting. The legal victory had cost him a fortune and earned him enemies who were not going to give up. As he sat on his porch that evening, looking out over the land his grandfather had left him, David wondered if it had all been worth it. He had defended his rights, but at what cost? And what would Patricia try next? He was about to find out that some victories come with a price that makes you wonder if winning was worth it. The morning after Judge Williams announced his ruling, David thought he might finally have some peace. He had won the court case, proved his hunting was legal, and defended his property rights. He was wrong about the peace part. David woke up to find 3 new posts on Patricia's Facebook page, each one more angry than the last. She was calling the judge's decision a travesty of justice and claiming that the legal system had failed to protect children. She was already planning her next move, talking about appeals and new strategies to hold dangerous hunters accountable. But what really got to David was a comment from someone named Todd Wellington, who lived just 2 streets over in Sunrise Ridge. Todd wrote, "This Miller guy thinks he can do whatever he wants just because he owns some land. Maybe it's time we showed him that being a bad neighbor has consequences." David had never met Todd Wellington, but the threat was clear enough. These people weren't going to stop. They were going to keep coming after him, using every legal trick and social pressure campaign they could think of. The court victory had only made them angrier and more determined. That afternoon, David drove to his lawyer's office to thank Robert Chen and pay the final bill. The total cost of defending his rights was $14,147. David wrote the check, but he was angry about every dollar. He had done nothing wrong, followed every law, and been a good neighbor for years. Yet he was the one paying thousands of dollars for the privilege of using his own property legally. "I'm sorry it cost so much," Robert said as he walked David to the door, "but you did the right thing. If you had given in to their demands, it would have set a terrible precedent. Property rights matter." David appreciated the sentiment, but he was tired of fighting. He was tired of being portrayed as the villain. He was tired of former friends crossing the street to avoid talking to him. Most of all, he was tired of spending his own money to defend rights that should have been obvious. Walking to his truck, David noticed a group of hikers heading toward the trail entrance to his property. They were wearing Sunrise Ridge Athletic Club t-shirts, laughing and talking about their weekend nature walk. These were probably some of the same people who had signed Patricia's petition, demanding that he stop hunting on his own land. That's when David had an idea. A perfectly legal, completely justified idea that would solve his problems and teach his neighbors an important lesson about property rights. David drove straight to the hardware store and bought 24 no trespassing signs. Heavy-duty ones with reflective lettering that would be visible from a distance. Then he went to an office supply store and bought a stack of certified mail envelopes. Over the next 3 days, David methodically posted no trespassing signs along every trail entrance and property boundary that connected to Sunrise Ridge. He installed them according to state law, spacing them no more than 50 feet apart and making sure they were clearly visible from any approach angle. The signs were simple and direct. Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. By order of property owner David Miller. David also sent certified letters to Patricia Kellerman and every member of the HOA board, officially notifying them that the informal arrangement allowing residents to use his trails was terminated immediately. The letter was polite but firm. "Due to ongoing harassment and legal action by the Sunrise Ridge HOA regarding my legal use of my own property," David wrote, "I am hereby revoking all permission for Sunrise Ridge residents to use the private trails on my land. This property is private, and any person found trespassing will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." The reaction was immediate and explosive. David's phone started ringing within hours of the first signs going up. The first call was from Coach Rodriguez, who was polite but desperate. "David, I understand you're upset about everything that's happened," she said, "but please don't punish the kids for what the adults have done. The cross-country team has been training on your trails for 5 years. We have a big meet coming up and the kids have worked so hard." David felt bad about Coach Rodriguez and the kids, but he had made his decision. "I'm sorry, Coach, I really am, but I can't continue to let people use my property while their neighbors are trying to destroy my life. The HOA board should have thought about the consequences before they started this fight." The next call was from Tom Bradley, an elderly resident who had been hiking David's trails since Sunrise Ridge was built. Tom had always been friendly and respectful, and David knew he had never supported Patricia's campaign. "David, this is going to hurt a lot of innocent people," Tom said. "There are families here who bought their houses specifically because of the trail access. Senior citizens who use the trails for exercise because it's the only safe place they can walk. Kids who've been exploring these woods since they were little." "I understand that, Tom," David replied, "and I'm sorry about it. But for 8 years I've been a good neighbor. I've maintained the trails, built bridges, installed safety equipment, and never asked for anything in return. When someone complained about my legal hunting, I tried to work things out reasonably. Instead, they dragged me through court and cost me $15,000. Actions have consequences. The phone calls continued all day. Some were angry, like the one from Todd Wellington, who accused David of being petty and vindictive. Others were pleading, like the call from Jennifer Hayes, whose 8-year-old daughter had been looking forward to a nature photography project on the trails. But the call that bothered David the most came from Patricia Kellerman herself. She was furious, threatening to sue him for breach of some imaginary contract and claiming that he was violating the rights of residents who had relied on trail access. "You can't just cut off access to trails that people have been using for years," Patricia demanded. "There are legal concepts like adverse possession and implied easements. We'll take you to court again if we have to." David had researched those exact legal concepts while preparing for his hunting case. "Patricia, you can try to sue me all you want, but I've never given anyone a written easement. I've never accepted payment for trail use, and I've always maintained signs identifying the property as private. You have no legal right to use my land, and you never did. I was just being a good neighbor, something you clearly don't understand." After hanging up on Patricia, David unplugged his phone. He had said everything he needed to say. Now he was going to let his signs do the talking. By the weekend, the impact of David's decision was becoming clear throughout Sunrise Ridge. The trails that had been a central feature of neighborhood life were suddenly off limits. Families who had planned weekend hiking trips had nowhere to go. The high school cross-country team had to find a new place to practice. Dog owners who had relied on the trails for exercise had to drive to distant parks. Real estate agent Monica Foster was showing a house in Sunrise Ridge when the buyers asked about the beautiful trails they had seen in the online listing photos. Monica had to explain that the trails were no longer accessible, and she watched the potential buyers' enthusiasm vanish instantly. "We specifically wanted this neighborhood because of the outdoor recreation opportunities," the husband told Monica. "If we can't use the trails, there's no point in paying a premium for this location." Monica had been selling houses in Sunrise Ridge for 6 years, always using the trail access as a major selling point. She knew that several other pending sales were going to fall through once buyers learned about the situation. The subdivision's property values, which had been stable for years, started to decline almost immediately. Online real estate sites began showing longer listing times and reduced asking prices for Sunrise Ridge homes. The beautiful trails that had once been a major asset were now a visible reminder of what residents had lost. Patricia tried to organize protests and petition drives to pressure David into reopening the trails, but the response was lukewarm. Many residents were starting to realize that Patricia's aggressive tactics had backfired spectacularly. They had lost access to amenities that had been a major reason for choosing the neighborhood. David installed security cameras at the main trail entrances to monitor for trespassers. Within the first week, the cameras caught several residents trying to use the trails despite the no trespassing signs. David printed the photos and sent them to the local sheriff's office, filing formal trespassing complaints. The sheriff, an elected official who understood the politics of the situation, sent deputies to speak with the trespassers. No arrests were made, but the message was clear. David was serious about enforcing his property rights. As winter approached, David felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He had successfully defended his property rights and taught his neighbors an expensive lesson about consequences. But he also missed the friendly interactions with hikers and the sense of community that sharing his land had created. Looking out his window at the empty trails, David wondered if there was any way to resolve the conflict that had torn apart what had once been a peaceful neighborhood. But first, Patricia Kellerman and the HOA board would have to acknowledge that their aggressive tactics had failed, and that compromise was better than continued warfare. Unfortunately, David was about to learn that some people never learn from their mistakes. By spring, the consequences of Patricia Kellerman's war against David Miller were impossible to ignore. What had started as a complaint about hunting noise had snowballed into a neighborhood crisis that was affecting everyone in Sunrise Ridge. The first major blow came from the real estate market. Monica Foster, the area's top real estate agent, had to deliver bad news to the HOA board at their monthly meeting. Home values in Sunrise Ridge had dropped by an average of 12% over the past 6 months. Houses that had once sold within weeks were sitting on the market for months. The trail access was a huge selling point for this neighborhood, Monica explained to a room full of increasingly worried homeowners. When buyers see those no trespassing signs and learn they can't use the trails anymore, they immediately start looking elsewhere. The Willowbrook development down the road is offering similar houses with actual park access, and they're outselling us 3-1, Patricia, who was still serving as HOA president, tried to downplay the situation. "This is temporary," she insisted. "Property values will recover once we resolve the safety issues and find alternative recreation options." But Tom Bradley, the elderly resident who had always supported David, stood up to challenge her. "Patricia, we had no safety issues before you started this fight. David Miller was a responsible hunter and a generous neighbor. Now we've lost trail access. Our property values are tanking and half the neighborhood won't speak to the other half. This is entirely your fault." The room erupted in arguments. Residents who had initially supported Patricia's anti-hunting campaign were now angry about losing their trail access and watching their home values decline. Others were furious at Patricia for creating the whole mess in the first place. The high school cross-country team had been forced to practice at a city park 15 miles away, which meant longer trips and less practice time. Coach Rodriguez had tried to find alternatives closer to home, but nothing compared to David's well-maintained trails. The team's performance suffered and they failed to qualify for the state championship for the first time in 8 years. Local businesses were feeling the impact too. The coffee shop near Sunrise Ridge had seen a significant drop in weekend customers. Families who used to stop for drinks and snacks after their trail hikes were no longer coming. The outdoor gear store in town reported that sales to Sunrise Ridge residents had fallen by 40%. But the real wake-up call came when Jennifer Hayes received a letter from her lawyer. Jennifer had been one of Patricia's strongest supporters, organizing petition drives and speaking at city council meetings about the dangers of hunting. But when she tried to sell her house to relocate for her husband's job transfer, she discovered that the loss of trail access had cost her family nearly $30,000 in equity. The house was appraised at $340,000 last year, Jennifer's lawyer explained. The current appraisal is $315,000, and that's optimistic. The appraiser specifically mentioned the loss of recreational amenities as a major factor in the reduced value. Jennifer was devastated. She had been so focused on the hunting issue that she never considered how her actions might affect her own financial situation. Now she was facing a significant loss when she could least afford it. The tipping point came at the annual HOA meeting in June. Patricia was running for re-election as president, confident that residents would support her continued leadership. She had prepared a presentation about maintaining community standards and exploring legal options to regain trail access. But when Patricia opened the floor for questions, she was met with a barrage of angry comments. Homeowner after homeowner stood up to express their frustration with the situation. They talked about declining property values, lost recreational opportunities, and the negative atmosphere that had settled over the neighborhood. Todd Wellington, who had initially supported Patricia's hardline approach, was particularly critical. "I signed your petition because I thought you were looking out for our safety," he said. "But now I realize you created a problem where none existed. My house has lost $25,000 in value because you couldn't tolerate the sound of legal hunting on someone else's property." The final blow came when Coach Rodriguez addressed the meeting. She had always been respectful in her criticism of the HOA board, but now she was clearly frustrated. "David Miller allowed our kids to use his trails for 5 years without asking for anything in return," she said. "He maintained those trails, installed safety equipment, and treated our athletes with respect." When Mrs. Kellerman decided to wage war against him, she didn't just hurt David. She hurt every kid on my team, every family that enjoyed those trails, and every homeowner in this subdivision. When the votes were counted, Patricia had lost by a landslide. The new HOA president was Tom Bradley, who had run on a platform of healing the neighborhood and making things right with our neighbors. Tom's first act as president was to write a formal letter of apology to David Miller. The letter, approved unanimously by the new board, acknowledged that the HOA had overreached and that David had been treated unfairly. It also included an offer to pay David's legal fees as a gesture of good faith. David was surprised when he received the letter. After a year of conflict and harassment, he had not expected an apology. But he was still cautious. Words were easy. Actions would prove whether the new board was serious about making amends. Tom Bradley requested a meeting with David to discuss possible solutions. They met at David's kitchen table on a warm summer evening, sharing coffee and talking like neighbors should. Tom brought along 2 other new board members who had opposed Patricia's campaign from the beginning. "David, we know we can't undo the damage that's been done," Tom said, "but we'd like to find a way forward that works for everyone." The neighborhood has learned a hard lesson about the cost of being unreasonable neighbors. David appreciated the apology, but he had conditions. I'm willing to talk, but things can't go back to the way they were. If trail access is going to resume, it needs to be formalized. No more handshake agreements that can be ignored when it's convenient. The negotiations took several weeks, but eventually, both sides reached an agreement. The HOA would pay David's legal fees, which totaled $14,847. They would also pay for a professional survey to establish exact boundaries and create an official easement agreement. The new agreement gave Sunrise Ridge residents limited access to designated trails during non-hunting seasons. The HOA would pay David a modest annual fee for trail maintenance and would be responsible for ensuring that users followed posted rules. Most importantly, the agreement included specific language protecting David's hunting rights and acknowledging that any future complaints about legal hunting activities would result in immediate termination of trail access. David also insisted on liability insurance and a clause requiring the HOA to educate residents about hunting seasons and safety. The agreement was signed by all parties and recorded at the county courthouse, making it legally binding. The first group of hikers to use the reopened trails was the high school cross-country team. Coach Rodriguez personally thanked David and presented him with a team jersey signed by all the athletes. The kids wrote thank you notes too, she said, handing him a stack of letters. They wanted you to know how much the trails mean to them. Property values in Sunrise Ridge began to recover almost immediately after the agreement was announced. Monica Foster reported that pending sales that had been canceled were being reinstated, and new listings were generating significantly more interest. Patricia Kellerman and her family quietly moved away from Sunrise Ridge 6 months later. Some residents said she couldn't handle the embarrassment of her failed campaign. Others believed she was angry about the new board's willingness to compromise with David. Either way, the neighborhood became noticeably more peaceful after her departure. Jennifer Hayes, who had initially lost money when she tried to sell her house, decided to stay in Sunrise Ridge. She became one of David's strongest supporters and often brought him homemade cookies. As a way of apologizing for her role in the conflict, the story of Sunrise Ridge became a cautionary tale that spread throughout the county. Other HOA boards learned about the expensive consequences of unnecessary conflicts with neighbors. Property lawyers began using the case as an example of how quickly community disputes can spiral out of control. David continued hunting on his property during legal seasons, but he also found that he enjoyed the restored sense of community. On weekend mornings, he would often encounter families on the trails and stop to chat about wildlife sightings or trail conditions. The hostile atmosphere that had dominated the neighborhood for over a year gradually gave way to the friendly relationships that had existed before. Looking back, David realized that the conflict had taught him important lessons about standing up for his rights and the value of good neighbors. The legal battle had been expensive and stressful, but it had also shown him that some principles are worth fighting for. The trails through David's property continued to be one of Sunrise Ridge's most valued amenities, but now everyone understood that access was a privilege, not a right, and that being a good neighbor was essential to maintaining that privilege. The formal agreement between David and the HOA became a model for other communities facing similar conflicts. It proved that even the most heated disputes could be resolved when reasonable people were willing to compromise and respect each other's rights. And on quiet autumn mornings, when David sat in his deer stand listening to the sounds of the forest, he could sometimes hear the distant laughter of children playing on the trails his grandfather had walked decades earlier. It was exactly the way the old man would have wanted his land to be used and enjoyed.